The Belmont Hotel's ballroom was filled almost to capacity, with tables covered in crisp white tablecloths, floral centerpieces, and elegant silver and porcelain services. There were already more than 200 guests, men in dark blue or gray suits with gold cufflinks, shiny black shoes, and silk ties. Women in expensive dresses with sequins and bows, with slits exposing exactly that part of the legs or neckline that is necessary for to outshine your rival, whoever she may be. Guests, many of whom were already in various stages of intoxication, milled around, forming small groups to talk and laugh, sipping drinks, pointing out new guests, and greeting them as they entered the room. The ballroom was filled with banners announcing the annual spring banquet of Prairieland Securities, a fairly large and successful financial company that was having a very good year. Nearly every head office employee was expected to attend the banquet, eat and drink, socialize and celebrate, and listen to speeches about how well the company was doing and how grateful they should be to work in such a fast-paced environment. Company. A little over 15 minutes before the start of dinner, as guests were just beginning to take their places at the tables, there was a slight excitement in the room when Frank Portis entered the room. Frank was widely known as the most flamboyant and aggressive of the employees, a man who in the next few months would likely be announced as the division's youngest leader. Tall, muscular, with an olive complexion, short dark hair, and sharp, well-defined features, he was handsome by almost any standard. But the attention he attracted had more to do with who he came with. Walking on his arm was Jolene Matthews, a woman who could not be described as anything other than stunning, coppery red hair flowing in long curls to the middle of her back, deep green Irish eyes against a background of flawless alabaster skin, and a figure with soft curves that define the very essence of female sensuality. She wore a black evening dress with forest green trim that tastefully accentuated her curves, and an elegant pearl necklace that separated her perfect body from her perfect face. Everything about her screamed for attention, and as if on cue, men and women stopped abruptly to admire her beauty as she and Frank paused briefly at the entrance before they plunged into the heart of the ballroom. Somewhere near the stands, a huge bear-like man with long, dark brown hair and a wild, bushy beard waved at Frank, getting his attention. Frank turned to Jolene and pointed to the bear. "Hey, there's Paul. Why don't you go that way and I'll get something to drink? Is white wine okay?" Jolene nodded, flashed a fluorescent smile, and headed toward the entrance of the ballroom, while Frank headed toward the bar, navigating a daunting obstacle course of tables, waiters, and guests. As he approached the bar, his progress was hampered by a mass of slow-moving people waiting and moving in a poorly organized line. Frustrated by the lack of movement, Frank allowed his thoughts to wander, mentally separating himself from the crowd with daydreams of victories at work and on the golf course, as well as thoughts of Jolene. The line had not advanced more than a couple of meters when his self-switching off was interrupted by the vague sensation that he heard his name being called. When he heard it for the second time, he turned around and was surprised to see the smiling face of his best friend from school. 11 years had passed since his graduation, and 2 years since his last meeting. Bobby Mullins was easy to remember, magnificent white horse teeth gleaming under a mustache, laughing eyes crinkled prematurely at the edges from smiling and the sun, and oily black hair slicked back. He was dressed in a dark blue suit, burgundy tie and silk shirt, and looked as elegant as everyone else in the room. But his speech and mannerisms were characteristic of a country boy from southern Illinois, raised among soybeans and cornfields, not among concrete and asphalt. "Bobby? Damn me. I'm glad to see you. What are you doing in town?" Frank reached over Bobby's left shoulder and pulled him closer, shaking his right hand. "I just got here. Came to the party, Frankie." "Wait, you came from St. Louis for the party? That's a long way, even for you, to get free food and drink." Frank laughed and, letting go of Bobby's hand, shook his head. "Hey, I have the right. Just because no one expects the peasants from the St. Louis office to come, that doesn't mean we won't come. I figured you Chicagoans have been staying away from us all these years, so I want to see what I've been missing. They made small talk for a few more minutes until the line moved, and they both took a couple of steps forward. Frank continued the conversation. So, Bobby, how are you doing outside of work? Are you still dating a new girl every month? I don't know. It's hard to keep track, but on average, it's probably like that. Bobby grinned mischievously. Sooner or later, I'll grow up and settle down, but not soon. Bobby and Frank chuckled, and then, after a moment of hesitation, Bobby asked quietly, Well, how do you like life, Frank? Everything is fine? Frank paused, making it clear that he did not have a simple or easy answer to this question. He pursed his lips tightly and ran a hand through his hair before beginning to answer. Well, everything seems okay. Now, I don't know if you heard or not, but Becky and I, well, we're not together right now. Bobby frowned, but showed no real surprise. I heard about it. I'm sorry, Frank. Hard case. Yes, this is true. There was an awkward silence for a moment before Frank awkwardly broke it by asking who Bobby had brought to the celebration. Oh, I came as a bachelor, Frankie, but I hope I don't leave like this. Bobby's eyes sparkled as he said this, and when he finished, he smacked his lips and raised his eyebrows defiantly. Typical, Frank said, shaking his head. Some things never change. Now they were standing in the front row, and Frank ordered 2 white wines, and Bobby ordered a beer. Frank gestured towards the podium and Jolene. Hey, Bobby, I'm with someone today, but why don't you come eat with us? Naturally, she is banned, but maybe someone else will sit at the table. Oh, I wouldn't interfere with your plans, Frankie, but yes, I would love to eat with you. Show me the way. Bobby picked up his beer bottle and downed it in a mocking toast. Happy anniversary, baby. Becky smiled at Frank across the table, her light brown hair falling in soft curls over her shoulders and framing a face with small, childish features that could be called beautiful, if not for a weak chin and too many freckles. She was wearing an elegant black dress, her left hand unconsciously fingering the string of pearls around her neck that Frank had given her, and her right hand raising a glass of champagne in a toast. Frank, raising his glass, smiled, admiring his wife. For us, forever. They clinked glasses and sipped bubbling pale yellow champagne as the setting August sun cast streaks of pink and orange through the window and onto the white tablecloth. This is a wonderful restaurant, a wonderful evening, Frank. Thank you very much. For everything, for the pearls and for everything. This is the least I can do for my wife, for the woman I love, for someone as beautiful as you. He nodded appreciatively towards her body. I like the way you look in this dress. You should wear it more often. She blushed and giggled. This is a special dress, for special occasions. I wouldn't want to weaken the magic it holds, otherwise the spell cast on you might weaken. Well, the dress helps, of course, but the spell is mainly cast by what's underneath. Frank gave her a lecherous grin. The waiter came over, ostentatiously placed the salads on the table, then pointedly sprinkled pepper on each of them, after which he filled the glasses with champagne and left, muttering some congratulations on their anniversary. Frank took a bite and, chewing slowly, looked at Becky's right forearm with some curiosity. After swallowing, he gestured with his empty fork. What is that on your hand? Is this a rash? Yes. Looks like a little poison ivy. I think I picked it up at the Netzall picnic while I was walking around the pond. Oh yes, I lost track of you for a while. You know, this is a very beautiful park, and I liked this pond. Yes, it's noticeable. I think you've been canoeing for several hours. Becky frowned slightly and aggressively attacked the piece of salad. Yes, it was a lot of fun. I would like to do it again. Becky pursed her lips in thought, and then looked at Frank with unexpected seriousness and stammered, You know I love you, don't you, Frank? That you are the only man for me? The unexpected decisiveness of Becky's statement took Frank by surprise and slightly puzzled him. He tilted his head and wrinkled his brow in response, looked at Becky for a moment, and then answered softly, "Yes, and I love you." He leaned across the table until his face was less than a foot from Becky's and continued, "But our relationship is more than love. We are comfortable with each other. We like each other and need each other." He gently touched the side of her face. "And we have trust. No matter what, after getting to know each other all this time, we both trust each other absolutely." Becky's smile faltered slightly as he said this, and she looked down at her salad, awkwardly breaking away from his gaze. When Frank arrived with the wine, Jolene smiled and kissed him on the cheek, whispering thanks before taking a sip. Frank, accompanied by Bobby, found her in a group with Paul and half a dozen other people, who were listening with obvious boredom to a short, slightly plump woman with unnaturally blonde hair and an extra chin, who described in grueling detail the various events and sights she and her husband had encountered during my last vacation in Europe. Her husband, an overweight vice president named Duncan, was as bored as anyone else, and, taking the opportunity, loudly greeted Frank and impulsively shook his hand, effectively interrupting his wife's monologue. While she looked forward to taking center stage again, all the potential listeners followed Duncan's example, greeting and introducing each other to Frank and Bobby, who joined the circle of strangers like an old friend. Paul Jensen, a huge bear of a man, introduced himself and his companion, a petite woman with black hair and a beautiful face named Angie Simmons, as Frank's friends and colleagues. Bobby immediately made Paul laugh with a double entendre about how he was jealous of his size, and made Angie blush with pleasure when he commented that he now understood the saying that good things come in small packages. When Bobby was introduced to Jolene, he raised his eyebrows and exhaled a soft whistle through his pursed lips, causing more laughter as he turned to Frank and said, "It looks like the Little Mermaid has grown up very well." "Great catch, Frankie. Great catch." The other two in the group were an older couple who, if he carried a pitchfork and she had her hair in a bun, could have been taken straight out of American Gothic. Not so easily charmed, they took greetings without humor, engaging in minimal interaction to avoid appearing rude before slipping away unnoticed, in one motion, avoiding interaction with young couples with whom they had little in common, as well as additional stories about travels from Duncan's plump blonde wife. Unfazed by their departure, Bobby continued to enthusiastically exchange stories of their acquaintance, drawing everyone along with him except Duncan's wife, who looked more than a little annoyed when it turned out that no one in the group wanted to hear any more about her European exploits. Finally, with ill-concealed irritation, Mrs. Double Chin announced that she was going to find a table with the other vice presidents and their wives. She left ahead of Duncan, who lingered long enough to say quietly, "Oh shit, now I have to listen to all this again. I'm sorry I've been such a bitch lately." Frank had just returned home, and Becky was sitting in an easy chair placed right in front of the front door, smiling coyly at him, crossing her legs, putting her hands on both arms of the chair, and combing her hair on her head. She wore a white corset, black thigh-high stockings, sky-high heels, and dramatic makeup with dewy red lips and smoky eyeshadow. Frank hesitated for a moment before raising his eyebrows, and finally responded with an exaggerated grin. "Well, either you're wearing a very naughty Halloween costume, or I'm going to have some luck today. Halloween was last week, baby. So I think it's fair to say I wore it for good luck." She laughed softly, making a sound similar to a confident cat purring seductively to get her way. Frank hung his coat on the coat rack, not taking his eyes off her. "I understand that after you pretended to be a nun for several weeks, you suddenly became interested in sex." Becky pouted slightly and stood up from her chair, placing her hands loosely on Frank's shoulders. "Forgive me for this. As I said, I was a bitch. I have every intention of making amends to you right now, and in the most sincere way." He placed his hands on either side of her waist, pressing lightly through her corset, and pulled her tightly towards him, inhaling the scent of her perfume and feeling the slight trembling of her body. He pressed his lips to her ear and felt the soft flesh of her cheek pressed against his face. "So, You think that after completely denying me sex under various flimsy excuses, you can just drag me back into bed by wearing underwear and threatening me with your finger? She pulled back to look at his face and found that he was smiling, but his eyebrows were raised in anticipation of an answer. Yes, Mr. Portis, yes it is. She said this in a syrupy sweet tone of mocking innocence. And you thought that I would forget all these refusals and your weak excuses to avoid sex and just jump into bed? Do you think I'm so frivolous? Well, you're a man. Doesn't that make you easy by definition? He grinned incredulously and shook his head. Honestly, lately you've been changing the temperature so often that sometimes I'm just at a loss. Yes, but I'm hot today, so be happy about it. Plus, I'm a woman, so part of my job is to mystify you. She smiled, winked at him, and, with a sultry gait, led him to the bedroom. 30 minutes later, Becky and Frank, naked, covered in a thin layer of sweat, with clothes scattered haphazardly on the floor, were kissing desperately and aggressively. Frank silently grabbed Becky by the shoulders, pushed her onto her back, spread her legs with his right thigh and moved on top of her. He looked her straight in the eye, watching her reaction, and suddenly he realized that she had frozen. He opened his eyes and saw that she was just lying there, and there was an expression on her face that he could not define. Disappointment, boredom, abstraction, somewhere else. What had started out as a passionate sexual encounter suddenly turned into something that could not be adequately described, and he felt a burning sense of disappointment and dissatisfaction. She turned away without a word, curling into a ball and turning her back to him. Frank reached out and touched her shoulder. What's happened? You completely abandoned me in the end. Sorry, I'm probably tired. Her voice was empty, soulless. Tired? Nonsense, Becky. I think you just lost interest. Are you tired of me? Is sex with me really that bad? You got yours. Why are you complaining? She asked, sharply, irritably. Stunned by her behavior, he stared at her back in disbelief for several moments before answering. I don't know what the hell is going on, Becky, but things have to change. This must change quickly. Becky let his words hang in the air for a few moments, and then answered softly, Yes, it is. The group had barely taken a table when bustling waiters began passing around plates of salmon, beef, and chicken, practically throwing the dishes onto the table in a desperate attempt to serve the full house of guests more or less simultaneously. As the waiters rushed to their table, the resulting noise and chaos from clattering plates, flying hands, and rapid-fire questions about food choices made conversation quite difficult. So, Paul, Bobby called loudly, nodding with a smile to the sweating young man who had just placed a plate of chicken in front of him. How long have you been working at Prairie? Paul pursed his lips and thought for a moment, looking at the ceiling. Probably about 12 years old. I went to work straight out of college. I started out in the research department, but about 5 years ago, I was transferred to the small client department, around the time Frank started working. We've been together ever since. Things are going well? Yes, I would say so. Management seems happy. Paul nodded casually in Frank's direction. They seem to think our guy walks on water. Bobby opened his eyes in mock surprise. Wait, what? Can he actually walk on water? I always thought yes. Jolene nodded to the waiter as he placed a plate of salmon in front of her, then looked at Bobby and grinned. Perhaps he has changed since you knew him. Well, it's hard to imagine that he became even more magnificent. In high school, he was always Mr. Wonderful, best in class, the best athlete, the most popular, the most successful. I was only around him to bask in his glory and try to pick up scraps from his table. Frank challenged Bobby, laughing. Maybe you're exaggerating a little. If I remember correctly, you were a good athlete yourself, and those girls you were hanging out with weren't exactly scraps from the table. One of them was a prom queen, and the other, if I remember correctly, was a contestant in the Miss Illinois pageant. Oh, never mind, Frank. Bobby waved his hand dismissively but playfully towards his old friend. The results speak for themselves. One of us went to Northwestern University on a full football scholarship, and then completed an MBA program at USC, and the other went to Eastern Illinois as an undergraduate and barely graduated. Wait, you played football for Northwestern University? Angie suddenly intervened, tilting her head to the side with curiosity. I did not know that. Oh, well, I didn't play. At least not very much. Frank smiled embarrassedly. I sat on the bench for 4 years. I think I played maybe 30 matches in the garbage time. But hey, it paid for college, so it worked out. Bobby looked at Angie, pointing a piece of bread at Frank. You could always recognize Frank. He was the guy who worked out between games. He was also the only guy who never went to parties or broke team rules. Funny, Frank. I think that's what they called him. Or maybe I came up with it myself. Bobby winked at Frank and laughed. But seriously, are you still Mr. Seriousness? Or haven't you been doing anything for fun lately? Mostly, I'm developing plans to improve Prairie's profitability, which is, of course, a lot of fun. Frank joked, eliciting a deep fog-like laugh from Paul and a few quiet chuckles from the women. No, actually, I still only read or play on the computer, and Paul and I play hops golf and sometimes go to the gym. Frank paused and playfully pointed an accusing finger at Bobby. But you don't understand this because you spend all your time at parties and bars. Maybe someday I'll grow up and be as boring as you, Bobby said with a wide smile, defiantly raising his bottle to take a sip of beer. But to be honest, I can't understand why I need to skip parties and give up drinking. Don't you think you've already drunk enough? The Prairie Land Securities Christmas party was winding down, and Frank and Becky were sitting at the table with Jolene, Paul, and the cute clerk from the accounting department. All three looked away with slight embarrassment from Frank's indignant and angry remark. They knew this was coming. He had been seething for almost an hour now, as she flirted and made intrusive remarks to almost everyone who approached the table, and her flirting worsened as the evening went on and the amount of alcohol consumed. Becky paused mid-drink, carefully placed her cocktail on the table, and looked with obvious irritation at Frank, who made no attempt to hide his displeasure. I'm not driving. What's the difference? She hissed defiantly. You don't have to drive to get into trouble because of drinking. Problems? What problems? Behavior problems, Becky. Don't you like my behavior? I thought I was being friendly. Aren't you always complaining about how, quiet I am? The clerk fidgeted with the growing discomfort caused by the hostile exchange, and now, unable to bear it any longer, she silently stood up and apologized, nodding slightly, and moved away from the desk as quickly as possible. Jolene and Paul felt no less uncomfortable, but they did their best to feign casual indifference to the flaring argument at the other end of the table, which, given the growing tension, they failed. Sensing their unease, Frank lowered his voice to an angry hiss to get his point across. Friendliness is good, Becky, but today you went too far. The way you dragged men onto the dance floor and flirted with them, the jokes and innuendos you subjected us all to, it's just ridiculous. My God, you embarrassed Bob Thomas and Steve Ananias so much in front of their wives with those kisses under the mistletoe that I thought they were going to leave the party early. Come on. You're drunk and everyone knows it, and that's causing problems. You humiliate me, and tomorrow you will be ashamed when, or if, you remember what you did tonight. Ashamed? Am I embarrassing you? Are you embarrassed by your wife? Becky's voice became loud and defiant. Keep it down, Becky. Damn, people are watching. Sorry, I don't want to embarrass you even more than... Jolene could not stand it and interrupted in a soft, even parental voice. You're not yourself right now, Becky. Let me take you to the executive lounge so you can take a nap. Becky turned to Jolene with fire in her eyes. I don't remember talking to you or asking your opinion. It's not your problem, so maybe you'll leave. Okay, Ginger? Stung, Jolene inhaled sharply, as if she had been struck. Look, Becky, I didn't mean... Becky waved off what she was about to say with a wave of her hand. Leave it alone, Jolene. Look, I'm sorry if my husband objects to me trying to get attention, but I guess I didn't expect someone like you to understand that people like me have to put in a little effort. You walk into a room like this with thick red hair, a perfect face and big tits, and men fall at your feet, but us mere mortals have to do a little more than bitches like you do. Becky suddenly fell silent, as Frank grabbed her arm roughly, hard enough to make her flinch. He pulled her close and then whispered sharply in her ear, "Get up, I'll take you out of here right now." She jumped to her feet as Frank lifted her and half stumbled, half followed him as he dragged her out of the room, pinning her roughly against the wall in the hallway. "I'm tired of your behavior, Becky. I'm over it. It's one thing to be cold, reserved, and sullen at home, but this public behavior, it's already crossing all boundaries, you know." She nodded weakly. "Frank, shut up and listen to Becky because I'm tired of this crap." Frank clenched his jaw and took a few deep breaths before starting again. "If you speak like that to my friend or colleague again, under any circumstances, I will explode. Is it clear?" Becky nodded. "And in particular, if you talk to Jolene like that again, well, you just better not do it, because I'll be incredibly angry and I don't know what I can do. In fact, I don't want you to talk to Jolene at all, under any circumstances, ever. Fine? Never again. So if I hear you talking to her or yelling at her, if she tells me she got a nasty phone call from you or a snide remark at an event or anything at all that upset her, I will come down with rabies, and you won't like the result. Understood?" A tear ran down Becky's cheek, but she refused to answer, only nodded dumbfounded. "Come on, I'll take you home and put you to bed." "Well, tell me," Bobby asked Jolene, continuing to chew a rather rubbery piece of dry chicken. "Here in Prairie, what do you do?" Jolene wrinkled her brow slightly. "I work at Net Solutions." "I see, I understand. But you mostly work at Prairie, right?" "Oh, yes, that's probably true. I actually spend a lot more time there than at NetSol. I'm working on a web product, helping create a personal investing web page for Prairie. She pointed to Frank and Paul. "Tell me what features their clients want, and I help implement them on the page. Basically, they are trying to make it easier for small individual investors to trade in their accounts." Bobby finally swallowed, washed it down with a long gulp of beer, and looked back at Jolene. "And how long have you been doing this, making Prairie more friendly to small investors?" he asked, bringing another piece to his mouth. "Oh, God." She tilted her head and rolled her eyes to the left, thinking for a moment. "I think a little over a year. Is that right, Frank?" "About a year?" Frank nodded. "Yes, something like that. We started working together on the initial materials in March of last year, but really got going in early summer." "So you are a programmer?" Bobby asked, chewing. "Not really. I have a degree in graphic design. Basically, I do the layout, trying to make the page user-friendly. I write some code, but the really complex stuff is written by the serious programmers at NetSol." Bobby finished chewing his next bite, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and, tilting his head, looked carefully at Jolene with an expression of gratitude and curiosity. "You know, I swear I've already met you somewhere, but I can't determine where exactly. This is unusual for me because my memory never fails me when I remember the time I spent with a beautiful girl." Frank snorted at his remark, and Bobby's face broke into a huge grin. Jolene shrugged and raised her hands, palms up. "I don't know where we could meet. I have never worked with an office in Prairie. I got my degree from Loyola." "I'm pretty sure I do," Angie offered, giggling. "Surely a lot of guys think they know her." "Jolene is the girl from the NetSol commercial." Bobby leaned back in his chair. "Huh?" "You know, the one in the commercial where some nerd is upset because his business is failing, and then a hot red-haired girl comes along, fixes his web page, and the guy gets rid of his glasses and turns into a super happy, successful businessman." Bobby's eyes opened wide in recognition. "Exactly. I knew I saw you. Hell, I almost wanted to start a failing business just to see if I could get you to come and fix it." Everyone at the table groaned and laughed. Bobby grinned and continued. "So, how did you get into advertising?" "Well, at that time I was helping with advertising, and I was involved in filming a video. They were auditioning actresses, the director saw me and, well, one thing led to another, and I ended up getting the part. You must have worked as a model or something too, I mean. Jolene raised her hands in protest, interrupting Bobby. Oh, I'm too crooked to be a model, Bobby snorted. Where I come from, there is no such thing as a too crooked woman. It's hard to believe you didn't at least try. To be honest, I never thought about it. Netzol advertising is the only thing I did. I think I didn't want to get so caught up in trying to be a model or something like that I lost sight of my career in graphics and ended up on the fringes. Where the hell have you been? It's almost midnight. Becky stood on the porch, her hand on the still open front door, her mouth opening and closing nervously, unable to make a sound, let alone words. She was wearing that black anniversary dress, stockings, high heels, and a lot of makeup. Well, Frank repeated aggressively. I'm waiting for your next excuse again. Really, I'm just dying of curiosity. Why did you show up at this time of night with your makeup ruined in this dress? What did you call it? Your magic dress? Frank took a step toward Becky and raised his eyebrows expectantly, his large frame dwarfing her as she pressed herself against the door. She was breathing in large, frightened, spasmodic breaths, looking around anxiously, desperately trying to avoid Frank's intense and aggressive gaze. To Frank, she had never seemed so small, so vulnerable, and so treacherous. Seriously, Becky, I'm waiting. I want to know. He took a deep breath. Who were you with this evening? Honestly, that's all I need to know, because I have a very, very good idea of what you've been doing. Becky finally closed the door and took half a step towards Frank, shaking her head frantically. No, Frank, it's not what you think, is not... Frank laughed bitterly. Spare me the cliches, please. It can't be anything other than what I think, Becky. Cannot. So just tell me this. Who the hell were you with? That's all I want to know. Frank, no, it's not... I can't tell you. Frank crossed his arms and stared at Becky, taking long, deep, angry breaths through his flaring nostrils. I've had enough, Becky. I'm not an idiot or a weakling. You act weird and guilty all the time. You can barely stand touching me, let alone sex. You wander around at night wearing a dress that is supposed to be designed to seduce your husband on special occasions. And this... He reached into his pocket and pulled out several sheets of lined pink stationery paper, heavily wrinkled and covered in writing. Becky winced. What? Where did you find... I found this confession at the bottom of a trash can yesterday. I must say that it clarified a lot for me. I agree that the only way to save our marriage would be to end your affair. No, it's not like that. But it's too late now, Becky. It's too damn late. Because I'm done, you know? I don't care who it is anymore. I'm over it. We're finished. Having finished speaking, Frank ran his hand over his throat and, picking up a large suitcase, headed towards the door. Becky tried to grab him, but he pushed her away as roughly as he could without hurting her. Within seconds, he was backing the car out of the driveway and heading to the nearest liquor store as quickly as possible. So, Jolene said, catching Bobby's eye as she peered around the waiter as he filled glasses with water. You probably have some interesting stories about Frank from his time at school. Maybe something Frank forgot to tell us. Bobby laughed and leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtfully at the ceiling. You know, I think I have a couple of such stories. He looked down and smiled, pointing his right hand at Frank. And if Frank is fidgeting there, it's because he knows that I know where the bodies are buried, so to speak. Yes, I think I may be the only guy in this room who can pierce a hole in the shroud of perfection that everyone at Prairie and Netzol thinks he's always worn. Bobby gave Frank a mischievous look. What do you think, Frank? Come on, Bobby, just be nicer, Frank warned, shaking his head in mocking disapproval. Oh, Frank. You know that I would never put you in an awkward position, in any case. Let's listen to something good, Jolene demanded, giggling. Well, there was that time he almost burned down the school's equipment shed when he modified a model rocket with fireworks. Oh, I heard that story, at least Frank's version, Jolene said, looking reproachfully at Frank. Okay, then he was telling you about the famous night when he was trapped alone in the basement. Bobby's voice suddenly stopped as he looked at Frank and noticed that his smile had become forced, and there was a look of apprehension in his eyes. However, Jolene did not notice the awkwardness and leaned forward. No, I haven't heard of any lonely nights in basements, Jolene said with a laugh. But now you have awakened my curiosity. Let's listen. This really isn't such a great story. Let us be the judge of this, Bobby, Jolene suggested with a devious grin. I think I'd like to hear the story about the basement, and I guess Paul and Angie would too. Bobby looked slightly nervously at Frank, who shrugged, apparently giving in to Jolene's desire to hear the story. Bobby began again, smiling a little more confidently, but still telling the story with some hesitation. Okay then. Frank was a senior in high school, and he had a girlfriend who was a little younger, a sophomore or something. And so, one evening it turned out that her parents should be out of town, it seems, at a bowling alley, and she invited Frank to her place to, well, you understand. Oh, I think I can guess what she was interested in, Jolene said, watching Frank's cheeks and ears turn pink. Frank seems to remember the story, she added with some pleasure at his discomfort. Bobby smiled faintly and continued. Well, anyway, the girl's siblings were at home watching TV or something, and she and Frank went down to the basement where there is a partially renovated rec room with a couch in it. Bobby paused and took a sip from his glass before continuing. It is my understanding that they were spending some, shall we say, quality time together on the couch when they suddenly heard the garage door open and her parents returned home. Bobby's audience now listened eagerly, laughing and quietly commenting as Bobby described the night, making Frank wince. Feeling that they appreciated the story, Bobby continued with more enthusiasm, speaking faster and more energetically. So, it turned out that her parents are very, very strict, super conservative to the point that if Frank were caught alone with her, he might get his ass hit with buckshot. I mean, she broke some important family rules by inviting him over when her parents weren't home, right, Frank? Frank chewed his lip anxiously as he listened to Bobby and nodded in response. Oh, yeah. Serious violations. Okay, she asked Frank to stay downstairs, and she ran upstairs to see what happened. Turns out her dad hurt his ankle or knee or something, so her family came home early, and he limped in and sat down in the chair that's right next to the only way out of the basement. There's no way to get past him, and Frank is completely trapped until Dad leaves, and Dad won't be gone for a while because he decided to spend the whole damn night in the chair, because he doesn't want to go upstairs with his bad leg. Bobby stopped giggling, his infectious laughter spreading through the audience. He rubbed his watery eyes and began again, clearly enjoying the resolution of the story. In short, Frank is stuck. His, girlfriend calls me. I arrive at the house and talk to Frank through one of the basement windows. There is no way out unless the window is broken. And Frank begins to panic because there is no toilet there and he begins to feel the call of nature. So I have no idea what to do. But the girl, well, she gets on the phone and calls a bunch of friends and says they need to come over right away. And there's so much panic in her voice that 4 of them show up immediately. Anyway, she takes us into the house and tells Dad that we've come to look at her, school project, which she says is in the basement. So we all go downstairs, hang out there for a few minutes, and then just head back up the stairs. Only when we get up, there are no longer 6 of us, but 7, because Frank is also with us. And her dad doesn't notice that there is another guy. He even waves to Frankie, asks how he's doing, and says he'll be keeping an eye on the Wildcats in the fall. Bobby paused to laugh. The only snag was that Dad started mentioning that he wanted to see her school project the next day, so we all got together and, in an hour or so, made a paper copy of Everest or what? Mount Vesuvius? Mr. Geography? Frank smiled. Yes, exactly. Mount Vesuvius. Damn, I love this story, Bobby said, laughing as he took another sip of his beer. I will never forget her as long as I live. Did you forget about basketball? The sound of the text woke Frank up, and he found himself more or less fully clothed, with his shirt, trousers, and one shoe half unbuttoned, lying on top of a tangled mass of rumpled sheets and clothes spilling out of his suitcase. His bladder was painfully full, his mouth was sticky and dry, and his head was pounding from the noise of traffic coming through the door. On the bedside table was a quarter-full bottle of scotch and an empty glass, as well as the intruder, a cell phone. He sat up abruptly, grabbed the phone, and fell back onto the bed, hitting his head painfully on the pillow. The cell phone helped him find his way. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, Saturday. He had 17 missed calls and messages. All but one were blocked messages from Becky. It was Paul's message that interrupted his sleep. Squinting painfully, trying to focus on the blurry cell phone remote control, Frank let out a groan and sent a reply message with trembling fingers. Unable to play, cancel. He went to the bathroom to relieve himself and drink some water, and by the time he returned, he had received another text from Paul. What? Where are you? Frank answered. Everything is bad at home. At the Holiday Inn in Schaumburg? Don't tell Becky. I come to you. No, everything is okay. Already coming. 40 minutes and a short nap later, Paul knocked on the door, making a noise that reverberated painfully in Frank's head, causing him to groan and curse. He staggered to the door and opened it quietly to admit Paul, who looked around the room with a mixture of disgust, surprise, and mild amusement as Frank struggled back to the bed. Frank, what the hell? I called your house this morning, Becky answered, but I didn't understand anything she said. She was, well, hysterical. She said something about you leaving her. Frank sat down on the bed, put his head in his hands, and looked numbly at his feet. One shoe was on, the other was off. That's exactly what I did. What did you do? He left her. Frank continued to look at his feet while Paul waited for him to continue, but Frank made no attempt to add to what was being said, the only sound being the noise of the heater and outside movement. Is that all? Won't you tell me anything else? What more? For example, an explanation of why you suddenly left your wife. Did you have a fight or something? Or something like that. Damn, I feel like I'm conducting a police interview with an uncooperative witness. Come on, Frank, what the hell is going on? Frank sat up and stared, unfocused, in the general direction of the half-open curtain and window. Finally, in a sad, robotic voice, he said, She had an affair, Paul. She's been cheating on me for a long time. What? Becky? Is it true? Is it true? Frank. What the hell? I called your house this morning, Becky answered, but I didn't understand anything she said. She was, well, hysterical. She said something about you leaving her. Frank sat down on the bed, put his head in his hands, and looked numbly at his feet. One shoe was on, the other was off. That's exactly what I did. What did you do? He left her. Frank continued to look at his feet while Paul waited for him to continue, but Frank made no attempt to add to what was being said, the only sound being the noise of the heater and outside movement. Is that all? Won't you tell me anything else? What more? For example, an explanation of why you suddenly left your wife. Did you have a fight or something? Or something like that. Damn, I feel like I'm conducting a police interview with an uncooperative witness. Come on, Frank, what the hell is going on? Frank sat up and stared, unfocused, in the general direction of the half-open curtain and window. Finally, in a sad, robotic voice, he said, She had an affair, Paul. She's been cheating on me for a long time. What? Becky? Is it true? Is it true? You are sure? To her? Do you want to tell me about this? No. Let me rephrase. You tell me about it right now. Frank took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, looking with some distant irritation at his friend, who was now sitting on a chair with its back turned to the bed. Okay. Let me think. Frank chewed his upper lip, absently eyeing the empty beer can on the floor, before he looked up again. Okay. Remember how I told you how weird Becky was acting? He acts guilty all the time, hides things. She was very bitchy, like at a Christmas party? Okay, so far it looks like all the girls I've ever had in one way or another. Funny, Paul. Frank gave him a look that showed that he was not very humorous. Anyway, it was a huge change for Becky, and then, well, remember when I told you I felt like I was being cut off from my sex life? What? Last autumn? Yes. It didn't end then. In fact, it never stopped. She just, I don't know, seems to have lost interest completely. We've only been together maybe a couple of times in the last few months. She's never in the mood, and when we do this, she's like a dead fish or something, which is to say sometimes she starts out like a tigress, but she can never keep it up, as if it took her a lot of effort to maintain at least some interest. What, you think she wanted to be with another guy or something? I asked her what was the matter, but she was very evasive. I didn't really want to talk about it. It's strange, though. Damn it, Paul, don't tell me your girls do the same to you, because what I'm describing was too strange, too different. Something was clearly happening to her, but I couldn't understand what exactly. In addition, she, in fact, admitted to treason, admitted it in writing. Paul looked stunned. What? Did she write you a letter or something? No, not at all. It's hard to explain, really. Frank chewed his lip before continuing. Look, I don't know if you know this or not, but Becky has a tendency to write things when she's stressed. Write them over and over again. Something like a fixation. Huh? Look, it's hard to describe, but here's an example. When she played softball in high school and continued to hit high pitches, I found 8 to 9 pages in one of her notebooks that said, I won't hit high serves. Again and again. Or a couple of years ago, when she thought she was getting a little heavier, I found her writing, I will run every day, on several sheets of paper. She was very embarrassed, but I didn't think it was anything special, maybe even cute in a weird way. Okay, so what? Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out sheets of crumpled pink paper, waving them in front of Paul. I found them by accident, a couple of days ago, in a trash can. He handed the papers to Paul. Look at what she wrote. Paul took the papers from Frank and laid them out on the table, turning on the desk lamp to get a better look. All over the sheet, at different angles, in different sized letters and fonts, the same sentence was written, over and over again. I will lose my marriage if I don't stop this. Stop what? Paul asked Frank. Well, to be honest, at first I thought she was talking about her behavior or something like that. Well, you know, I will lose my marriage if I don't stop being a bitch. But look at the other pages. Paul shuffled the sheets of paper, and Frank poked his finger at them when Paul reached the correct pages. He looked at what he had written for a minute, and then, in a slightly distant and puzzled voice, read aloud, I will lose my marriage if I don't stop this affair. He turned to Frank with a stunned expression on his face. Damn it, Frank. Did she say what it was about? Who was the affair with? Frank made a sour expression on his face. Damn. I don't know, but it all ended last night. I was supposed to be working on implementing a new system, but I came home early when the servers went down and just let the people at NetSol do the work to make it work. I told her I would be working late, maybe all night, and she thought she could get around me without getting caught. She returned home only around midnight. Frank paused for a moment to collect his thoughts, rubbing his face nervously and taking a deep breath before continuing. And this wasn't the first time. She actually did something like this a couple of times when she got home late from some fake event or project, but it was just funny. He took another deep breath before continuing. So, when she returned home, she was all made up. in a very sexy dress and with a lot of makeup, obviously just from a date. I thought that I would just silently walk past her and leave when she returned home, but the sight of her simply threw me off balance, and I attacked her. That is, I very persistently demanded that she confess, tell who she was dating. And, as usual, she practically refused to answer. She didn't say who she was with, what she did, or anything like that. I got so angry that I just jumped out of there. He left and got drunk, and here I am. Paul sat down next to Frank, who sat hunched over, face down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped at the back of his head. He patted Frank on the back several times. "Look, buddy, what are you going to do now?" Frank muttered in response. Now I'm moving on. Now I'm going to amputate a gangrenous limb and try to remake my life." He sat up and looked straight at Paul. "I'm done with her, in every way, forever." Paul nodded his head in understanding. "Okay, buddy, okay. You seem to be a little distracted from your thoughts." Jolene tilted her head and looked at Frank with amusement and curiosity. Frank looked back and smiled, the fork of chicken hanging a few centimeters above his plate. "I think this chicken isn't tasty." Everyone at the table laughed a little. "Well, I think Angie and I should raid the dessert counter," Paul announced, pushing back his chair and helping Angie to her feet. "Anyone else?" The other three silently refused, and Paul led Angie away from the table. A moment after they left, Jolene reached under her chair and picked up her purse, then stood and briefly smoothed down her dress. "I need to quickly go to the girls' room. I'll be back in a minute." She exchanged a smile with Frank and turned to leave, her hourglass shape changing smoothly as she walked away. Bobby pulled his chair closer and leaned towards him. "There are a lot of moving parts here, Frank. Very high-quality parts." Frank smiled and shook his head. "Well, Bobby, I guess I'd be surprised if this somehow escaped your notice." Bobby nodded in agreement with a laugh and then became somewhat thoughtful. He moved even closer to Frank. "Hey, listen, Frank. Forgive me for that story. It's okay, Bobby. It's a funny story. Yes, it is. I just, you know." He stopped and took a sip of beer, swirled it absent-mindedly in his mouth for a few moments, then swallowed it and continued apologizing. "Look, it's obviously none of my business, but I heard about you and Becky, and I wasn't sure you wanted me to bring up the story with her, especially around that Jolene girl. So, I'm sorry. Sometimes I get so carried away that it's okay, really. Honestly, I don't think anyone would have guessed that Becky was the girl in this story, and even if they did, it's no secret that we had a pretty long relationship." "Yes, okay. Bobby smiled and looked straight at Frank. Then his expression darkened, his forehead wrinkled, and his smile disappeared completely. "Frank, again, it's none of my business, but I've always considered you and Becky friends, and I guess I'd just like to know what the hell happened." Frank pursed his lips into a tight, awkward grimace as he considered Bobby's question. "Sorry, Frank, this is not mine. Look, Bobby, I don't want to go into detail today, but Becky, she cheated on me." Frank paused, waiting for Bobby to express surprise, but his face remained neutral. His mouth and eyes did not move at all. He simply nodded and listened, waiting for the next statement. "And for a while I tried to get her to talk about it, but she didn't want to talk. In the end, I just had to leave. I didn't have a choice, really." Bobby pursed his lips thoughtfully and looked at the table, tapping his fingers, thinking. Frank," he began hesitantly, looking back at his friend. "Look, it looks like you tried to get her to talk before you left. But since then, have you talked to her? Maybe now she'll talk." Frank's face darkened, and his tone became tense, abrupt, with a bitter note. "Why, Bobby? Why should I talk to her now? What difference will it make at this point? She ended the marriage. This is her problem. Why should I listen to her stories?" "Well, damn it, Frank. You have been married for over 7 years. At one time, you were a wonderful couple, wonderful from the very beginning. Everyone knew that you would get married. You probably put 100,000 miles on your car, driving back and forth from the Northwest every weekend while she was still in school. And then as soon as she could, you moved to Chicago and... And what? Frank asked, almost accusingly. Yes, we were very close and devoted to each other for a long, long time. Or at least I was committed to her. In the end, it's just a bigger punch in the gut, more painful, a betrayal. Bobby shrugged, apparently agreeing with this. And yet, Frank, don't you think... if you've put in so much time and effort, and don't you think you should get some kind of closure or something? Frank snorted derisively. Completion? This sounds like some newfangled shit, Bobby. I live on. I'm fine. I don't need anything more from her. Maybe she will need this. Maybe for her, Bobby said with some doubt, looking nervously around the table. Frank studied Bobby for a few moments and moved to his seat, moving a little closer to him. What's the matter, Bobby? What's happening? Bobby raised his head but did not meet Frank's gaze, but stared at a point just beyond his right shoulder. Frank, listen. Bobby was the easiest conversationalist Frank had ever known, and his difficulty with words was strange. So strange that it occurred to him that Bobby was planning something he wouldn't like, something related with Becky. Did Becky talk to you, Bobby? Did she push you to do something? There was an urgent, demanding tone in Frank's voice, and Bobby responded by looking straight at Frank, meeting his gaze irresolutely. Frank, listen, this will probably make you angry, but I felt it was the right thing to do. Bobby licked his lips and rubbed the back of his neck nervously, briefly breaking eye contact with Frank, and then re-establishing it. Frank waited with a stern, expectant expression on his face. Here's the thing, Frank. I didn't come here alone today. Another pause, but this time, Bobby didn't take his eyes off Frank. I came with Becky. She's sitting at one of the far tables. Frank's face turned red, his nostrils flared, and his jaw muscles began to work hard on his teeth, making a barely audible grinding sound. Why the hell did you do that, Bobby? Are you trying to make some kind of scene? What were you thinking? Frank, listen. Bring this bitch here tonight? They were silent for a moment, both breathing as if they had just run a race. Frank, I talked to her. Just talked on the phone for a bit last week. She didn't tell me what she did, and I didn't ask. She just said that she ruined everything and that you left her. All she wanted to do was talk to you. All she needs is a few minutes. She said she tried everything. Phone, email, SMS, letters. She said she couldn't get closer to you until you ran away. Come on, Frank. No matter how bad she did, don't you think she deserves a few minutes to talk it out? Even if it's just an apology? What could be wrong with this? Bobby spread his arms to the sides and bowed his head slightly in supplication as he asked the last question. Frank's face, and perhaps his whole body, suddenly seemed firm and unyielding. He leaned forward close to Bobby and spoke with a hiss through clenched teeth. I'll tell you what could be bad about it. She betrayed me. She stabbed me in the back after I gave her 10 faithful years. I turned down so many women for her. Bobby, you have no idea how many, and at the first opportunity she... Frank stopped and began to take deep breaths to keep calm. At the first possibilities, she is selling our marriage. Bobby listened to Frank's words and nodded almost imperceptibly. Even if so, Frank, even if so... Frank suddenly lost control of himself, interrupting him almost with a cry. I won't talk to her, Bobby. Not here, not now, not ever. Several people at nearby tables looked up from their conversations at Frank's outburst, looking around with curiosity and concern, and Bobby was so stunned that he raised his hands in a placating gesture and slowly stood up. I understand, Frank. I understand. Okay. He walked a couple of meters away from the table. Now I will leave you. I don't want to create problems. He turned to leave and saw Jolene exiting the restroom, engaged in a conversation with several male employees. Bobby watched her for a second, how her beauty attracted men to her, like the sun attracts planets to itself, causing them to rotate, and the planets do not have their own will, but obey the solar command. Bobby turned back to Frank and gestured at her. "Frank, are you sure you're not avoiding Becky because you don't want to risk what you have with Jolene? I don't think I would want to talk to my ex either if it was on the line." Frank narrowed his eyes angrily and hissed, "Fuck you, Bobby. Fuck you. That's not the point. Not this." Bobby nodded. "No, probably not. Probably not. Sorry, Frank. Forget what I said." He gestured to Jolene, who had freed herself and was now making her way to their table. "Tell her I'm sorry I had to leave without saying goodbye, but it was nice to meet her. She's a good girl, really. See you, Frank." Frank grunted in response. Bobby stepped back from the table, smiled and waved at Jolene, and then quickly walked away. "Hey, guy, we have to go. What are you doing?" Paul was dragging a suitcase containing Frank's clothes down the hallway when he noticed him on the couch, flipping through a photo album. Yes, sorry. I guess I just wanted to take one last look at..." Frank choked slightly on the last words and didn't finish. Paul walked up behind him and looked over his shoulder. "Wedding photos?" "Yes. I guess I'm just revising. I thought it was a pretty good marriage. Maybe a great marriage. Hell, other than college, we were inseparable for almost 12 years. Just last summer, we were ready to start a family, and then everything fell apart. It's still hard to believe, really. Everything we did together, I mean." Paul looked at the photo. Becky, in her wedding dress, looked at Frank with absolute adoration as he waved to well-wishers on the church steps. He shook his head slightly in disbelief. "Yes, it's hard to understand how people change so much. But it happens, doesn't it? Remember I told you about my Uncle Mark? He seemed completely happy. A wonderful marriage to my aunt. Or so everyone thought. And then, out of the blue, he goes off to see some bitch he met at a convention in Baltimore. Almost without warning. My aunt still can't come to her senses, but she had several very bad years." Paul paused and patted Frank on the shoulder in a consoling gesture. "My advice? Move on. Let it go. My aunt let it eat her. You do not have to. You have many options." Frank shrugged. "Honestly, Paul, I'm doing really well. It doesn't hurt me much now. I'm just kind of numb to it all, I guess. And it's not so difficult for me to move on. Hell, Jolene and I date each other so often that we have no time to be angry and no chance of being lonely." Frank smiled absently. Paul shrugged and laughed. "Normally, I would advise you to be careful with outside relationships, but Jolene, well, I don't mean to be rude, but she's too hot to be considered just a support under any circumstances." Frank closed the wedding album and smiled widely. "Yes, I guess I was lucky after all. I was truly lucky to have met her. Seriously, my main problem is not loneliness or bitterness or regret, but trying to keep my pants buttoned until the divorce is final." Paul looked slightly surprised. "Are you waiting for a divorce? Like this?" Frank clasped his hands behind his head and leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before returning his gaze to Paul. "It's kind of strange, right? I mean, a walking erotic dream," Paul suggested when Frank paused. Frank laughed. "Maybe. I was going to use a more romantic term. But, yes, she is everything a guy needs, not only physically, but also in behavior. She is the complete package." He was in thought and bit his lip for a second. "And, in general, she really likes me. I mean, she's made a few, suggestions that we should get a little closer, and I'm damn sure I wouldn't turn her down if I pressed her. But I think I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I didn't do anything wrong, that I didn't cheat or break my vows, even though I know most guys wouldn't blame me for getting her into bed. I just want to have a clear conscience, you know?" Paul shrugged and smiled. "Okay, that makes sense, but Frank, if it were me, I don't think I'd be so worried about a clear conscience." He winked at Frank and then looked at his watch. "Oh my God, seriously, We need to load this whole thing into the truck. It's almost 3:30, and you said Becky finishes work at 4:30. If we want to avoid it... Yeah, I definitely want to avoid her, Frank said, standing up. I really don't want to listen to her bullshit. She keeps feeding you nonsense. I still haven't talked to her since I left. Didn't talk at all? No. Before I left, she had many chances to talk, but she didn't want to. And now, frankly, I just don't want to listen to her. There's nothing she can say that would make me change my mind, and I don't feel any obligation to try to make her feel better. As you advised, I'm going to move on and make a clean break, and nothing she says will help with that. Jolene returned to the table and carefully, gracefully settled into the seat next to Frank, smiling all the time. Where did Bobby go? He probably had some urgent business to attend to. There was an awkward, prolonged pause, and Frank decided to abruptly change the topic of conversation. Hey, Paul and Angie are still waiting in line at the dessert bar. Would you like to try something now? No, thanks, I'm fine. I'm already full. There was silence again, and Jolene tried to start a conversation, talking about the project, about the people she had just met, about the scenery, but Frank did not intervene, answering in monosyllables or simply nodding his head in response to her questions or statements. Frank, you seem preoccupied or distracted or something. Is there something wrong? Frank cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair. Nothing special, but it turns out that Becky is here and... Jolene sat up abruptly, and her face suddenly looked as if she had eaten something incredibly bitter. Her eyes almost closed and her lips pursed into an unpleasant grimace as Frank continued. Well, I just don't want to make a scene like at a Christmas party? Jolene chimed in, her face relaxing a little. Yes. Jolene took a deep breath, smiled, and patted Frank's arm. Well, I'm a little surprised she's here, but honestly, now that I think about it, I'm not that worried, baby. I'm sure she won't make a scene. Last Christmas, I think she was just trying to make you jealous. Frank snorted. I think she was just trying to pick up some guy. I mean, she had no reason to make me jealous. I'm her husband, damn it. Jolene shook her head, a knowing smile on her face, the kind of smile a mother might have when a child displays innocent ignorance of the way the world works. Frank, I think she had a lot of reasons to be jealous, at least in her understanding. Frank furrowed his brow in confusion. What are you talking about? I never gave her a reason. Jolene laughed involuntarily, quickly covering her mouth to somehow smooth out her reaction. Oh, Frank, come on. We both behaved well, but in fact, you and I have been very close for some time, and we haven't really hidden it. What are you talking about? Before I left Becky, before she cheated on me, we never gave anyone any reason to assume that we were in a relationship. Jolene tilted her head and received Frank's statement with mild surprise and incredulity. Remember the Netzall picnic last summer, Frank? How about this? And what? We spent some time together and... Frank, we spent 2 hours together in the canoe and quite a lot of time after that. At least 4 different women asked about my new boyfriend and wondered how serious it was. A surprised and slightly puzzled expression appeared on Frank's face. Well, maybe, but we just... Frank brought his hand to his forehead and slowly rubbed it. Even though maybe we spent too much time in that canoe, it was months before the Christmas party and she never said anything and I didn't give her any other reason to think that. What? Oh, Frank, are you sure? Have you ever talked too much about me or smiled too often when you mentioned my name? She leaned forward and spoke more quietly, almost conspiratorially. You never said my name when you and her were together? No, I never... Jolene shook her head. Ah, Frank, honestly, you just don't know anything about this. Yes, Frank, yes, you did it. You did this all the time. No, I don't. Wait, how do you know? Frank hesitated, unable to find the words to ask a full-fledged question. I know because... Jolene sighed, exhaling the air from her mouth in a slow, controlled exhale. Listen, Frank, she told me. She told me that almost every time you lay in bed, you said my name. It was hard for her. Frank's mouth and eyes opened in surprise, and he began to say something, but Jolene stopped him with a raised hand. Listen, she made me promise not to tell you that she talked to me. And honestly, she was so upset, and I felt so sorry for her that I made that promise and swore to myself that I would try to distance myself from you, that I'll try to do the right thing. But when I found out that she cheated on you, that she ruined your marriage, well, I didn't think I needed to stay away at all. If this stupid bitch wanted to leave on her own, then I saw no reason to stay away from the man I wanted. And probably, I also see no reason why I should keep my promise not to tell you about that evening. That evening? What evening? She called. What? No, she came personally to my apartment. I was working, and when I came home, she was waiting for me in front of the door. She must have been there for several hours because I returned home quite late. Apparently, she had already come to see me several times, but she got scared and left before I showed up. But that night she said she was going to meet me face to face because she thought we could be together. Jolene paused to take a sip of wine, and Frank slowly shook his head, a dazed and confused expression on his face. So, yeah, she was sure we were having an affair and decided her best chance was to show up and fight for you, not literally, of coursey. You know, compete like women do. She waited for Frank to respond, to show that he understood her words, but all he could do was nod weakly. Jolene sighed and continued. So she was wearing a beautiful black dress and pearls, and she clearly put a lot of time into her hair and makeup. Maybe too much makeup, but she still looked... What was this evening? Frank's voice became dull and robotic. What evening? This was when the server crashed. Do you remember? We thought we'd have to work late and... Frank could no longer hear what Jolene was saying. His mind was frantically working on new facts that were rapidly bringing new truths to his consciousness. And as he did so, the old truth receded, turning instead into an ugly mistake, into an expanding, festering wound on his conscience. Thoughts took the form of clearly visible images, overlaid with perfectly remembered sound memories that flashed through my head at breakneck speed. The image of Becky looking away guiltily when he talked about trust, Jolene's voice. We spent 2 hours together in the canoe and quite a lot of time after that. At least 4 different women asked about my new boyfriend. The strange beginnings of Becky's selfless avoidance of sex, and when they did have it, the memories of the sudden loss of interest and passion, of her pulling away from him, pouting, getting angry and standing still, all the while listening. She told me that almost every time you were in bed, you said my name. The rage he felt when she came home late wearing a sexy black dress that was supposed to be reserved for special occasions, and she wore it for her lover. She thought the best chance was to come and fight for you. She was wearing this beautiful black dress and pearls. His feeling of angry disappointment and bewilderment when she refused to say where or who she was with, hearing his own voice explain why. If I hear you talking to her or yelling at her, if she tells me she got a nasty call from you, or a snide remark at an event, or anything at all that upset her, I will go crazy. Stunning. Stunning confirmation of his suspicions when he found notes with the inscription. I will lose my marriage if I don't stop this affair, is perceived in a new way, in a different light. That evening, she said that she was going to confront me, confront us, really, because she thought that we could be together. She was sure that we were having an affair. And then more sounds, more memories, randomly and jumbledly taken from the distant and recent past, invading his wounded consciousness wider and wider. Do you, Francis Angelo Portis, take Rebecca Ann Smithson to be your lawful wife? You know that I love you, don't you, Frank? That you are the only man for me, to have and to possess from this day forward, for better or for worse. But it's too late now, Becky. Too damn late. Because I'm done. You know what? I don't care who it is anymore. I've had enough. We're done. Richer, poorer in sickness and in health, to love and cherish. Are you sure you're not avoiding Becky because you don't want to risk what you have with Jolene? Until death do you part, according to God's holy law. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I didn't do anything wrong. And suddenly he heard his name again, like a distant echo, taking him back to the gala, to the food, the drink, and Jolene. Frank. Frank. What's wrong with you, Frank? You're completely disconnected. Frank peered into the incomparably beautiful face, pure alabaster skin, abundant red hair falling in thick curls to the shoulders, snow-white teeth and sensual full lips, and saw the truth. Saw that he wanted her perfect face and perfect body, and he wanted it enough to sacrifice his marriage to the only woman he loved, if only he could find a way without tormenting his conscience. And he found it. Oh, God, Jolene, oh, God. That was a bad idea, Bobby. Becky sat at a table with Bobby and another couple she had studiously avoided talking to all evening, trying again and again to spot Frank, who was sitting with Jolene at a table near the entrance. She saw that they were in the middle of an emotional exchange when he looked up and saw her looking at him from across the room. He turned to Jolene and continued his animated conversation, gesturing once, twice, 3 times in her direction, and then stood up, looked in her direction, and began to approach. He's angry and is going to ask me to leave. It will be terrible. He thinks I'll make a scene like in... Maybe, Bobby interrupted, but at least you'll have a chance to diffuse the situation. You wanted this yourself. Now this is your show. Bobby stepped back, away from Becky, effectively leaving her alone as Frank approached. Frank walked slowly, hesitantly, carefully, making his way between the tables. But he walked with purpose, and there was a sense of drama in his demeanor that primarily caught the attention of the man at the podium who was preparing to make some announcements. His gaze went to Frank, and one by one, table by table, their attention turned to Frank as he moved forward towards Becky. With each step, the collective consciousness of the hall became more and more concentrated on him. Conversations died down, one after another. The hall became quieter with each step. Strangely quiet. Quiet, like a church. And so he stopped, swaying slightly, breathing heavily, and stood silently in front of the sitting Becky. She sat quite straight, her hands folded politely in her lap, her soft hair loose, and she wore a beautiful white dress, simple, modest, and clean. A dress that was perhaps more suitable for a wedding than a party. No one spoke for a few moments, but Becky made several unsuccessful attempts, her mouth opening and closing 6 times. Finally, with visible effort, she broke the silence. Frank, I didn't cheat on you. She said it simply, in a broken voice. I just wanted you to know that I won't cheat on you. He just nodded slowly, but when he didn't respond, she continued. I know that I can't compete with her, and it will be very difficult for me without you. But at least I wanted you to know that I am faithful. I don't think I could move on with my life if you walked away thinking I cheated on you, that I betrayed you. I'm not sure I can live without you, but I know that I can't live with the thought that you hate me. Please, Frank, please believe me. Their eyes locked for a few moments, and Frank began to tremble quietly, still unable to speak, his eyes becoming glassy and then wet. And then, finally, he took one hesitant step towards Becky, causing her to sigh quietly, which was repeated by the observers when he abruptly knelt down, as if before an altar, took her hands in his, and, without saying anything, continued to look into her eyes. A look of shock and then uncertainty crossed Becky's face. She carefully withdrew her right hand and, with a hesitant movement, gently brought it to Frank's face, feeling a tear run down her thumb. Frank? Becky, I'm so sorry, Becky. I love you, Becky, and I'm so sorry. Becky absorbed the words of her kneeling husband, the sadness in his voice, the expression on his face, the gentle touch of his hands, and, suddenly seeing clearly, she realized that a miracle had happened, that her husband not only believed her, but still loved her. He returned to her. She burst into tears. If you want, I can take you home. Bobby approached Jolene, who sat with tears in her eyes and looked at what everyone in the room saw. After kneeling in front of Becky for a few minutes, Frank stood up, lifted her by the arms, hugged her, and kissed her, long and romantic, passionate, and at the same time tender, the way a groom kisses a bride. Then, without breaking eye contact, he took her hand and led her towards the exit. "Oh God, I really wanted him. I didn't even imagine that this would happen. I thought maybe I don't know." Jolene's voice broke as she spoke. Bobby gave her a sympathetic look, but tried to suppress a grin. "You know, I think everything will work out well for you. You will always have many options." "Yes, possible." She frowned at the exit as Frank and Becky finally left the room. "Well, let's take you home." He smiled at her as warmly as he could. "For that matter, Jolene, I think that you are the only woman in the world who could, at least for a little while, distract Frank from Becky." She smiled sadly at Bobby and shrugged. "Maybe. But this is not a very pleasant consolation, is it?" She took a deep breath through her nose and released it in a long, sad sigh. "I guess I just want what she has, what they have. Like everyone else," Bobby said, helping her up. "Like all. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one."